The neuroscience of habit formation begins in a structure most people have never heard of, despite the fact that it governs much of what they do each day. The basal ganglia sits deep in the center of your brain, beneath the cortex where conscious thought happens, and it specializes in something remarkably specific. It learns patterns. It detects sequences. It takes behaviors you've repeated enough times and converts them into something that no longer requires your attention. This process isn't metaphorical. When you first learned to tie your shoes, brush your teeth, or drive a car, your prefrontal cortex was intensely active. That's the part of your brain responsible for executive function, for working memory, for consciously managing the steps of a complex task. Every movement required deliberate attention. You had to think about where your hands went, which finger moved next, how much pressure to apply. It was exhausting because maintaining that level of conscious control demands significant metabolic resources. Your brain was burning glucose at a high rate just to get through a simple sequence. But something shifts after enough repetitions. The basal ganglia begins to encode the entire sequence as a single chunk. Neuroscientists call this chunking, and it's visible on brain scans. As a behavior becomes habitual, activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases, while activity in the basal ganglia increases. The behavior gets compressed. What once required step-by-step conscious monitoring becomes a packaged routine that can be triggered and executed with minimal oversight. This matters because once a behavior is chunked in the basal ganglia, it operates largely outside conscious awareness. You can tie your shoes while thinking about something else entirely. You can drive a familiar route and arrive with almost no memory of the journey. Your brain has offloaded the task to a system that runs automatically, freeing up cognitive resources for other things.
This is efficient. It's also why changing habits feels so difficult.
You're not just fighting a bad decision, you're fighting a deeply encoded motor and cognitive program that has been stamped into your neural architecture. The stamping process involves dopamine, and this is where habit formation intersects with the brain's reward circuitry. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, but it's more accurately described as the learning signal. When you perform an action and something good happens, dopamine neurons fire in a structure called the ventral tegmental area. That dopamine release doesn't just make you feel good. It strengthens the connections between the neurons that were active just before the reward arrived. It's a tagging mechanism. It marks the preceding behavior as worth repeating. In the early stages of learning a new behavior, dopamine spikes are large and tied directly to the reward itself. You do something, you get a result, dopamine
Surges. But as the behavior becomes habitual, something interesting happens. The dopamine spike shifts. It begins to fire not when you receive the reward, but when you encounter the cue that predicts the reward. Your brain learns the pattern. It starts responding to the trigger rather than the outcome. This is why habitual behaviors can feel almost compulsive. The craving isn't for the reward itself anymore. It's for the execution of the behavior that your brain has learned to associate with that reward. Research with rodents demonstrates this clearly. When a rat learns to press a lever for food, you can watch the transition happen in real time using neural recording techniques. Early on, dopamine neurons fire when the food appears. After many repetitions, they fire when the rat hears the click that signals the lever is active. Eventually, they fire when the rat is simply placed in the chamber where the lever exists. The entire sequence has become anticipated, predicted, and encoded. The rat doesn't decide to press the lever in any meaningful sense. The context triggers the behavior automatically. Humans are more complex, but the underlying mechanism is similar. If you've ever walked into your kitchen and found yourself opening the refrigerator without consciously deciding to do so, you've experienced this. The context,
the kitchen, has become a cue. The behavior, opening the fridge, has become chunked. And unless you actively interrupt the sequence, it unfolds automatically. This is procedural memory in action, the same system that lets you ride a bike years after you last practiced. Procedural memory is distinct from declarative memory, the kind you use to recall facts or events. You can forget the name of your childhood pet, but you'll never forget how to walk. Procedural memories are stored differently, and they're remarkably persistent. They don't fade the way declarative memories do. Once the basal ganglia has encoded a behavior as a habit, that encoding remains available even if you stop performing the behavior for months or years. This explains why people who quit smoking can experience cravings decades later when they encounter a specific trigger, like the smell of cigarette smoke or the end of a meal. The habit isn't gone, it's dormant. The structure of a habit follows what researchers call the habit loop. There's a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is any stimulus that triggers the behavior. It could be a time of day, a location, an emotional state, or a preceding action. The routine is the behavior itself. The reward is whatever positive outcome the brain associates with completing the routine. The reward doesn't have to be objectively good. It just has to register in your brain as worth pursuing. This is why people develop habits around behaviors that harm them. The brain's reward system isn't a morality detector. It's a pattern detector. Understanding the habit loop helps clarify why. Willpower is such an unreliable tool for behavior change. Willpower is an executive function. It lives in the prefrontal cortex. It requires conscious effort, attention, and metabolic resources. When you try to resist a habitual behavior using willpower alone, you're essentially asking your prefrontal cortex to override a program running in the basal ganglia. That's possible, but it's cognitively expensive. It's like manually overriding an autopilot system. You can do it, but you can't do it indefinitely. Eventually, your attention will lapse, your glucose levels will drop, or you'll encounter a stressor that diverts your cognitive resources. When that happens, the automatic behavior reasserts itself. This is why people who rely on willpower to change their habits so often fail. They're fighting their own neural architecture. They're trying to consciously control a system that was designed to operate without conscious control. It's not a character flaw. It's a mismatch between strategy and mechanism. The alternative approach involves working with the basal ganglia rather than against it. Instead of trying to suppress a habit through constant vigilance, you can change the cues, alter the routine, or substitute a different reward. You can build new habits that leverage the same automatic processes the old habits used. This doesn't eliminate the need for effort, but it shifts the effort to a different point in the process. You're not fighting the habit every moment, you're redesigning the conditions under which the habit operates. One of the clearest demonstrations of this principle comes from studies on context change. When people move to a new city, start a new job, or undergo any major life transition that alters their daily environment, their habits become temporarily disrupted. The old cues aren't present anymore. The automatic behaviors don't get triggered in the same way. This creates a window of opportunity. During that window, it's significantly easier to establish new habits because the brain is already in a state of adaptation. It's relearning its environment. New patterns can be encoded without competing directly against old ones. This doesn't mean you have to move to change your habits, but it does suggest that altering your environment in strategic ways can reduce the burden on your willpower. If you want to stop eating cookies every afternoon, you could try to resist the urge through sheer determination. Or you could stop buying cookies, remove them from your house, and eliminate the cue entirely. The second approach doesn't require ongoing self-control. It requires one decision that changes the context, and then the automatic behavior has nothing to latch onto. The basal ganglia doesn't care what it automates. It will happily encode a morning run or a nightly dessert binge with equal efficiency. What it requires is repetition, consistency, and a clear reward signal. If you perform a behavior repeatedly in the same context and your brain registers some form of positive feedback, the behavior will gradually become automatic. The key is understanding that this process takes time. Habits don't form overnight. The often cited claim that it takes 21 days to form a habit is a misinterpretation of older research. More recent studies suggest the timeline varies widely depending on the complexity of the behavior and individual differences, but the average is closer to 66 days. Some behaviors become automatic faster, others take longer. The point is that habit formation is a gradual process of neural encoding, not a sudden transformation. And because the process is gradual, it's also forgiving. Missing a single repetition doesn't erase the progress you've made. The encoding in your basal ganglia doesn't disappear if you skip one day. What matters is the overall pattern. If you perform the behavior consistently over time, the habit will form. If you occasionally lapse but return to the behavior, the habit will still solidify. The brain is tracking the statistical regularity of the behavior, not demanding perfection. This has implications for how you approach behavior change. If you're trying to build a new habit, the focus should be on repetition and consistency rather than intensity. It's better to do something small every day than something large sporadically. The basal ganglia learns from frequency, not magnitude. A 5-minute daily walk will encode faster than an hour-long run once a week. The daily walk provides more opportunities for the pattern to be stamped in, more chances for the cue routine reward loop to be reinforced. The same principle applies in reverse. If you're trying to break a habit, you need to disrupt the pattern consistently. One day of resisting a behavior isn't enough. The habit is still there, encoded and waiting for the next cue. But if you can interrupt the loop repeatedly, replacing the routine with something else, or avoiding the cue entirely, the automatic behavior will begin to weaken. It won't disappear completely. Procedural memories are too durable for that. But it will become less dominant, less likely to activate without conscious prompting. Context is not just the backdrop for behavior, it's the trigger. When researchers study habit formation in controlled settings, one of the most consistent findings is that behaviors become bound to the environments in which they're repeated. This binding happens through a process called context-dependent memory, and it operates at a level far below conscious awareness. Your brain is constantly scanning your surroundings for patterns, for cues that predict what should happen next. When you enter a familiar location, your hippocampus retrieves associated memories and behavioral scripts. It primes certain actions and inhibits others based on what typically happens in that space. The hippocampus is essential for this process. It's the brain structure responsible for spatial navigation and episodic memory, but it also plays a critical role in linking behaviors to contexts. When you perform an action repeatedly in the same location, the hippocampus creates an association between that physical space and the behavior. The next time you enter that space, the hippocampus activates the associated memory trace, which in turn cues the basal ganglia to execute the habitual routine. This happens automatically, without any conscious decision on your part. This is why you might walk into your bedroom intending to grab a book and find yourself checking your phone instead. The bedroom has become associated with phone checking through repeated practice. The context overrides your conscious intention. It's also why people who quit smoking often report that cravings intensify in specific locations, like their car or the back porch where they used to smoke. The location itself has become a powerful cue, one that activates the entire habit loop, even when the person is consciously committed to not smoking. The strength of context-dependent cueing has been demonstrated in studies where participants learn a behavior in one environment and are then tested in a different environment. Performance consistently drops when the context changes. The behavior is still there, encoded in memory, but it's harder to access because the environmental cues that normally trigger it are absent. This is true for everything from simple motor tasks to complex cognitive skills. Medical students studying in one room perform worse on exams taken in a different room. Athletes practicing in one gym show decreased performance when competing in another venue. The context has become part of the memory itself. This principle extends beyond physical locations. Time of day functions as a context cue. If you drink coffee every morning at 7, your brain begins to anticipate caffeine at that time. Your body starts producing cortisol and other waking hormones in response to the time cue, preparing for the expected behavior. If you skip the coffee one morning, you'll likely feel sluggish or develop a headache, not just because you're lacking caffeine, but because your brain expected it and prepared for it. The anticipation itself has become part of the pattern. Emotional states also serve as context. If you've developed a habit of eating when you're stressed, the feeling of stress becomes a cue that triggers the eating behavior. This is why emotional eating is so difficult to interrupt. You're not just fighting hunger, you're fighting an automatic response to an internal state. The stress activates a learned behavioral script that promises relief, and the behavior unfolds before you've consciously registered the decision. Social contexts are cues as well. You might behave one way when you're alone and a completely different way when you're with certain friends. This isn't necessarily inauthentic. It's context-dependent activation. The presence of specific people cues specific behavioral patterns that you've practiced in their company. If you tend to drink more when you're with a particular group, the group itself becomes a cue. Seeing those people activates the drinking script, and unless you consciously interrupt it, the behavior happens automatically. The practical implication of context-dependent memory is that changing your environment can be one of the most effective tools for changing your behavior. This doesn't require dramatic action. Small environmental modifications can disrupt old cues and create new ones. If you want to stop mindlessly snacking while watching television, you could move the television to a different room, rearrange the furniture so you're sitting in a different position, or eliminate the snacks from the space entirely. Each of these changes alters the context, which weakens the association between the location and the behavior. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called the fresh start effect. People are more successful at initiating behavior changes at temporal landmarks, moments that represent the beginning of a new period. The start of a new year, the first day of a month, a birthday, even the beginning of a new week. These temporal landmarks create a psychological sense of separation from past behavior. They feel like clean slates. But part of why they're effective is that they often come with contextual changes. A new year might involve new schedules, new social obligations, new weather patterns. These contextual shifts disrupt old cues, making it easier to establish new patterns. Studies on habit change in real-world settings show that people who move to a new home or start a new job have significantly higher success rates in adopting new habits compared to people whose environments remain stable. This isn't because they suddenly develop more willpower. It's because their old behavioral cues are no longer present. The automatic behaviors don't get triggered in the same way. They have to consciously decide what to do in each situation, and during that decision-making window, they can choose new behaviors. If they repeat those new behaviors consistently in the new context becomes associated with the new behavior. A new habit forms. This is also why vacations can temporarily disrupt bad habits. When you're in an unfamiliar environment, your usual cues aren't present. You might find it easier to eat healthily, exercise more, or avoid behaviors you struggle with at home. But when you return home, the old context reactivates the old behaviors. The habit hasn't been eliminated. It's been temporarily suppressed by the absence of its triggering cues. To make the change permanent, you'd need to either sustain the new behavior long enough in the old context to overwrite the association, or you'd need to modify the old context so it no longer cues the unwanted behavior. Environmental design, sometimes called choice architecture, leverages context-dependent cueing in deliberate ways. The idea is to structure your surroundings so that desired behaviors are cued and undesired behaviors are not. This can be as simple as placing a water bottle on your desk if you want to drink more water, or as complex as redesigning your entire living space to align with your goals. The key is recognizing that your environment isn't neutral. It's constantly signaling to your brain what to do next. Some of the most effective environmental modifications involve creating what researchers call commitment devices. These are changes you make in advance that constrain your future behavior. If you delete social media apps from your phone, you've created a commitment device. The behavior, scrolling through social media, now requires extra steps. You'd have to reinstall the app, which gives you a moment to reconsider. That moment of friction interrupts the automatic behavior. It doesn't eliminate the desire, but it introduces a gap between the cue and the routine, and in that gap, conscious decision-making can occur. The opposite approach also works. You can reduce friction for behaviors you want to encourage. If you want to exercise in the morning, you can lay out your workout clothes the night before. You can set your alarm across the room so you have to get out of bed to turn it off. You can schedule a workout with a friend so there's social accountability. Each of these strategies modifies the context to make the desired behavior easier and more likely. You're not relying on willpower in the moment. You're setting up conditions in advance that guide your behavior automatically. Context can also be used to create separation between competing habits. If you work from home and find yourself distracted by household chores, establishing a dedicated workspace can help. The workspace becomes associated with work-related behaviors. The rest of your home remains associated with leisure or domestic tasks. This spatial separation helps your brain switch between modes. When you enter the workspace, work-related behavioral scripts activate. When you leave, they deactivate. Without that separation, the cues get mixed, and it becomes harder to maintain focus because your brain isn't sure which script to run. Sensory cues are particularly powerful because they operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. Smell is one of the most direct pathways to the hippocampus and amygdala, structures involved in memory and emotion. A specific scent can instantly activate memories and associated behaviors. If you've ever caught a whiff of a particular perfume and been transported back to a specific time and place, you've experienced this. Habits can be bound to smells in the same way. If you always drink coffee in a space that smells like vanilla, the vanilla scent alone can trigger the coffee drinking routine. Sound works similarly. If you listen to a particular type of music while studying, that music becomes a cue for focus. Playing the same music later can help you enter a study-focused state more easily. Athletes use this principle when they create pre-performance routines that involve specific songs. The music becomes part of the context, and hearing it activates the mental and physical state associated with performance. Even subtle changes in lighting, temperature, or visual arrangement can function as cues. Your brain is tracking all of this information continuously, building associations between environmental features and behaviors. This is why habit researchers often recommend keeping your bedroom dark, cool, and free of screens. You're training your brain to associate that specific environment with sleep. The more consistent the association, the stronger the cue, and the more automatically sleep-related behaviors will activate when you enter that space. The challenge with context-dependent memory is that it cuts both ways. Just as new contexts can help you establish new habits, old contexts will continue to trigger old habits unless you actively disrupt the associations. This is one reason why relapse rates are high for people trying to quit addictive behaviors. They return to the same environments where they practice the addiction, and the context immediately cues the behavior. The neural pathways are still there, encoded and ready to activate. Breaking those associations requires consistent exposure to the old context without performing the old behavior. This is a form of extinction learning. Each time you encounter the cue and don't perform the routine, you weaken the association slightly. Over time, the context loses its power to automatically trigger the behavior. But this process is slow and requires repeated exposure. One or two instances of resisting aren't enough. You need to overwrite the old association with a new one, and that takes time. The most effective strategy often combines context modification with new behavior substitution. You change the environment enough to disrupt the old cues, and you establish a new routine that gets associated with the modified context. This way, you're not just fighting the old habit, you're building a new one in its place. The basal ganglia still gets to run an automatic routine. It's just a different routine, one that serves your goals rather than undermining them. There is a specific moment in behavior change that determines success or failure, and it happens before the behavior itself. It's the moment when you encounter a situation and have to decide what to do. For most people, this decision feels active and conscious, something that requires willpower or self-control. But research on implementation intentions suggests that you can bypass this moment entirely by making the decision in advance. You can program your response to a specific situation so that when the situation occurs, the behavior unfolds automatically, without requiring any in-the-moment deliberation. Implementation intentions follow a simple structure. If this situation occurs, then I will perform this behavior. The format is rigid and specific. It's not a vague goal like, I want to exercise more, or a general intention like, I should eat healthier. It's a concrete plan that links a situational cue to a specific action. If it's 7 in the morning and I'm in my bedroom, then I will put on my running shoes and go outside. If I finish eating lunch, then I will immediately go for a 10-minute walk. The precision matters because it creates a direct association between the cue and the behavior. The mechanism behind implementation intentions involves the prefrontal cortex, but in a different way than willpower does. When you form an implementation intention, you're essentially preloading a decision. You're telling your prefrontal cortex to watch for a specific cue and to execute a specific response when that cue appears. This doesn't require ongoing cognitive effort. The monitoring happens automatically at a subconscious level. Your brain detects the cue and initiates the behavior without engaging the deliberative processes that normally slow down or derail behavior change. Studies comparing people who set implementation intentions to those who set only goals consistently show that implementation intentions lead to higher rates of behavior completion. In one widely cited study, participants were asked to write a report over the holiday break and submit it by a specific deadline. Half the participants were simply given the goal. The other half were asked to specify exactly when and where they would write the report. The implementation intention group had a completion rate of 75%. Goal-only group had a completion rate of 33%. The difference wasn't motivation or commitment. Both groups wanted to complete the task. The difference was that one group had created a specific cue behavior link, and the other hadn't. This works because the brain treats implementation intentions similarly to how it treats habits. The if-then structure mirrors the cue routine pattern that the basal ganglia uses to automate behavior. When you specify the situational cue, you're essentially programming a trigger. When you specify the behavioral response, you're defining the routine. The main difference between an implementation intention and a fully formed habit is that the implementation intention requires conscious effort to establish and may need to be reinforced deliberately for a period of time before it becomes truly automatic. But even in the early stages, before full automaticity develops, implementation intentions reduce the cognitive load required to initiate the behavior. The reason this approach sidesteps willpower is that it eliminates the need for in-the-moment decision-making. Willpower is depleted when you have to repeatedly make difficult choices, especially choices that involve resisting immediate gratification in favor of long-term benefit. Each decision draws on a limited pool of cognitive resources. But if the decision has already been made through an implementation intention, there's nothing to deliberate. The situation occurs, the behavior follows. You've effectively created a behavioral shortcut. This is particularly useful for behaviors that people tend to procrastinate. Exercise is a classic example. Most people who don't exercise regularly will tell you they intend to exercise. They have the goal. They recognize the benefits. But when the moment comes to actually do it, they find reasons to delay. They're too tired. They'll do it later. They'll start tomorrow. An implementation intention removes that decision point. If it's 6 in the evening and I'm at home, then I will change into workout clothes and begin exercising. When 6 in the evening arrives, the cue triggers the response. There's no debate. The specificity of implementation intentions is critical. Vague plans don't work because they don't create clear cues. If you tell yourself you'll exercise sometime in the evening, your brain doesn't know when to initiate the behavior. Evening is a range of several hours. There's no precise moment when the cue is present. So you drift through the evening and the behavior never gets triggered. But if you specify 6 in the evening, your brain has a clear signal. At 6, the cue is present. The behavior should occur. The same applies to the situational component. If you only specify a time, you're relying on temporal cueing alone, which can work, but is less robust than combining time with location or a preceding action. If it's 6 in the evening and I'm finishing dinner, then I will change into workout clothes. Now you have 2 cues, time and activity, which makes the trigger more reliable. Your brain is more likely to detect the situation and initiate the response. Research on implementation intentions has expanded beyond simple one-time behaviors to explore how they can be used for ongoing habit formation. The idea is that by consistently following the same if-then plan, the behavior gradually becomes habitual. The initial implementation intention provides the structure and reduces the cognitive burden during the early stages when the habit is still fragile. Over time, as the behavior is repeated in response to the same cue, the association strengthens and the behavior becomes more automatic. Eventually, you might not even consciously register the if-then plan anymore. You just do the behavior when the situation occurs. This approach has been tested in various domains with consistent results. Medical patients who form implementation intentions around medication adherence take their medications more reliably. Students who create if-then plans for studying complete more study sessions. People trying to eat healthier who specify exactly when and where they'll eat fruits and vegetables consume more of them. The mechanism is the same across contexts. The implementation intention creates a mental link between a situation and a behavior, and that link facilitates action. One of the interesting findings from this research is that implementation intentions are particularly effective for people who struggle with self-regulation. If you're someone who finds it easy to stick to plans and follow through on goals, you might not need implementation intentions. You're already doing something similar naturally. But if you're someone who struggles with procrastination, distraction, or inconsistency, implementation intentions provide external structure that compensates for weak self-regulation. You're not trying to strengthen your willpower. You're building a system that works around the limitations of willpower. The limitations of implementation intentions are worth noting. They work best for behaviors that are under your direct control and that can be performed at specific times or in response to specific cues. They're less effective for behaviors that depend on other people or on unpredictable circumstances. If your implementation intention is, "If my colleague asks me to go to lunch, then I will suggest a healthy restaurant," you're relying on your colleague to provide the cue. That introduces uncertainty. The cue might not occur, or it might occur at a time when you're not prepared to execute the response. Implementation intentions also require initial effort to create. You have to think through the specific situations where you want to perform the behavior and the exact action you'll take. This isn't difficult, but it does require a level of planning that many people skip. They set goals without defining the path to those goals. The goal is the destination. The implementation intention is the map. There's also some evidence that implementation intentions can backfire if they're too rigid or if they're applied to too many behaviors at once. If you create a dozen different if-then plans, you're essentially asking your brain to monitor for a dozen different cues simultaneously. That reintroduces cognitive load. The monitoring itself becomes burdensome. Most researchers recommend starting with 1 or 2 implementation intentions and adding more only after those have become habitual. Another consideration is that implementation intentions work best when the behavior is something you're genuinely motivated to do. They facilitate action, but they don't create motivation. If you have no intrinsic desire to exercise and no belief that exercise will benefit you, an implementation intention won't magically make you start running. It will just make you aware that you're not following through on your plan, which can lead to guilt or frustration. Implementation intentions are tools for bridging the gap between intention and action, but they assume the intention exists in the first place. Some researchers have explored variations on the basic implementation intention structure. One variation involves creating if-then plans for obstacles. If I feel too tired to exercise, then I will do a shortened version. If I'm tempted to skip my morning routine, then I will do just the first step. These are sometimes called coping plans, and they acknowledge that the ideal situation won't always occur. By planning for obstacles in advance, you reduce the likelihood that an unexpected challenge will derail your behavior entirely. Another variation involves combining implementation intentions with goal intentions. A goal intention specifies what you want to achieve. An implementation intention specifies how and when you'll work toward it. Using both together creates a more complete behavioral framework. The goal provides direction and motivation. The implementation intention provides the mechanism for action. Without the goal, the implementation intention might feel arbitrary. Without the implementation intention, the goal remains abstract and difficult to pursue. The prefrontal cortex plays a central role in executing implementation intentions, particularly in the initial stages before the behavior becomes automatic. When you form an if-then plan, you're engaging areas of the prefrontal cortex involved in prospective memory, the ability to remember to perform an action at a future time. Prospective memory is what allows you to remember to stop at the store on your way home or to call someone at a specific time. It involves holding a future intention in mind and monitoring for the appropriate moment to act. Implementation intentions leverage prospective memory by creating a clear trigger, instead of trying to remember to exercise at some point during the day, which places a continuous burden on your working memory. You create a specific cue that signals when the behavior should occur. The prefrontal cortex doesn't have to actively maintain the intention throughout the day. It just has to detect the cue when it appears and initiate the response. This is far less cognitively demanding. As the behavior is repeated and the association between the cue and the response strengthens, the role of the prefrontal cortex diminishes. The behavior starts to run more automatically through subcortical structures like the basal ganglia. This is the transition from intentional action to habitual action. The implementation intention serves as a scaffold during this transition. It provides structure and support while the habit is forming, and then it becomes less necessary as the habit solidifies. For people trying to change long-standing patterns, implementation intentions offer a way to interrupt automatic behaviors and replace them with deliberate ones. If you have a habit of checking your phone first thing in the morning, you can create an implementation intention that specifies a different behavior. If I wake up and reach for my phone, then I will instead put on my slippers and go to the kitchen. This requires you to recognize the cue, the moment you reach for your phone, and to consciously override the automatic behavior. Initially, this will feel difficult because you're fighting an established habit. But if you consistently follow the implementation intention, the new behavior can begin to compete with the old one. The key is consistency. Implementation intentions don't work if you follow them sporadically. The brain needs repeated pairings of the cue and the response to form a strong association. If you sometimes follow the plan and sometimes don't, the association remains weak and the behavior won't become automatic. This is where self-monitoring can be helpful. Tracking whether you followed through on your implementation intention provides feedback and reinforces the behavior. It also helps you identify situations where the plan isn't working, which allows you to adjust the cue or the response. Your existing habits are anchors. They're behaviors you already perform reliably, often without thinking, and they represent stable points in your daily routine. Habit stacking is the practice of attaching new behaviors to these existing anchors, using the completion of one habit as the cue for the next. The logic is straightforward. If you already do something consistently, that something can serve as a trigger for a behavior you want to adopt. You're not trying to create a new cue from scratch. You're piggybacking on a cue that already works. The structure is similar to implementation intentions, but with a crucial difference. Instead of using a time or location as the cue, you're using a behavior. After I pour my morning coffee, I will write down 3 things I'm grateful for. After I brush my teeth at night, I will lay out my clothes for the next day. After I sit down at my desk, I will spend 2 minutes planning my priorities. The existing habit, pouring coffee, brushing teeth, sitting at your desk, provides a reliable and consistent trigger because it's something you already do automatically. This approach leverages a principle from behavioral psychology called behavioral momentum. Behaviors that are already in motion tend to continue. Once you've initiated one action, it's easier to continue with a related action than it is to start from a state of inactivity. This is why people often find it easier to exercise for 30 minutes than to start exercising at all. The hardest part is the initiation. Once you're moving, momentum carries you forward. Habit stacking uses this principle by linking behaviors into sequences. The first behavior generates momentum that carries you into the second. The brain encodes sequences of actions as units. When you perform the same sequence repeatedly, the individual actions become chunked together in memory. This is how complex skills like playing a musical instrument or performing a gymnastics routine become automatic. Each movement flows into the next without conscious deliberation. The entire sequence is stored as a single motor program. Habit stacking intentionally creates these sequences, linking new behaviors to existing ones so that over time, the entire chain becomes automatic. Research on action sequences shows that behaviors linked together are more resistant to disruption than isolated behaviors. If you perform 3 habits in a row and something interrupts the second habit, you're likely to complete the third one anyway because the sequence has momentum. Isolated habits are more fragile. If something prevents you from performing a standalone habit, that's the end of it. But if that habit is part of a chain, the other links in the chain can help pull you through the disruption. The selection of the anchor habit matters significantly. It needs to be something you do consistently, ideally every day, and it should occur at a time or in a context that makes sense for the new behavior you want to add. If you want to stretch every morning, anchoring it to your morning coffee makes sense. If you want to review your goals every evening, anchoring it to brushing your teeth before bed makes sense. The connection doesn't have to be thematically related. It just has to be logically sequenced. The anchor happens, then the new behavior happens. One of the advantages of habit stacking is that it reduces decision fatigue. You're not spending mental energy deciding when to perform the new behavior. The anchor habit makes that decision for you. As soon as you finish the anchor, the new behavior is cued. There's no deliberation, no window for procrastination. The sequence unfolds. This is especially useful for small behaviors that are easy to skip precisely because they're small. Meditation, journaling, stretching. These are activities that people often intend to do, but never quite get around to because they don't have a clear place in the daily routine. Habit stacking gives them a place. The size of the new behavior should be considered carefully when you're first establishing the stack. If the new behavior is too demanding or time-consuming, it creates resistance. You might complete the anchor habit, but then avoid the new behavior because it feels like too much effort. This breaks the sequence and prevents the association from strengthening. The recommendation is to start with a version of the new behavior that's so small it feels almost trivial. After I pour my coffee, I will do 1 push-up. After I brush my teeth, I will floss 1 tooth. The point is to establish the sequence, not to achieve dramatic results immediately. Once the sequence is reliable, you can gradually expand the behavior. This is sometimes called scaling, and it's a common strategy in habit formation research. You start with a minimal viable version of the behavior, establish consistency, and then incrementally increase the intensity or duration. The minimal version reduces friction and makes it easier to follow through. Over time, as the behavior becomes automatic and you experience the benefits, natural motivation often leads to expansion. You started with 1 push-up, but now you're doing 10 because it feels good and you're already in position. The habit stack created the entry point. The physical and temporal proximity between the anchor habit and the new behavior also influences success. If there's a long gap between finishing the anchor and starting the new behavior, the connection weakens. The brain doesn't encode them as a sequence, they're separate events. But if the new behavior immediately follows the anchor, the brain groups them together. This is why it's helpful to choose anchors that naturally occur just before the time or place where you want to perform the new behavior. If you want to meditate in your bedroom, and you already make your bed every morning, stacking meditation after bed making creates a smooth transition. You're already in the room, already in a state of minor physical activity. Starting meditation from there is a small step. Multiple behaviors can be stacked onto a single anchor, creating longer chains. After I pour my coffee, I will write in my journal. After I write in my journal, I will review my calendar. After I review my calendar, I will identify my top priority for the day. Each behavior becomes the anchor for the next. The entire sequence can eventually run automatically, triggered by the initial anchor. But building chains like this takes time and should be approached incrementally. Trying to establish a 5-behavior chain all at once is likely to fail because there are too many points where the sequence can break. It's more effective to establish one link at a time, allowing each to become solid before adding the next. There's evidence that habit stacks are more effective when the behaviors within the stack are thematically related or when they serve a common goal. A morning stack that includes stretching, meditation, and goal setting feels cohesive because all 3 behaviors contribute to starting the day with intention and physical readiness. A stack that includes unrelated behaviors like watering plants, checking email, and doing squats might work, but it's less intuitive. The thematic coherence helps the brain encode the sequence as a meaningful unit rather than a random collection of actions. One challenge with habit stacking is that if the anchor habit gets disrupted, the entire stack can collapse. If you travel and your morning routine changes, you might stop performing all the behaviors that were stacked onto that routine. This is a vulnerability of the approach. The stack is only as reliable as its anchor. To mitigate this, some people create backup stacks for different contexts. You have your standard morning stack for when you're at home, and you have a simplified travel stack for when you're away. The behaviors might not be identical, but they serve similar purposes and maintain the pattern of sequential action. Another consideration is that not all habits make good anchors. Some behaviors are too variable in their timing or context. If your anchor habit is something like, after I eat lunch, but your lunchtime varies wildly from day to day, the stack becomes unreliable. The cue isn't consistent enough to support a new habit. Better anchors are behaviors that happen at roughly the same time every day in roughly the same context. Waking up, brushing teeth, arriving at work, leaving work. These are typically stable anchors because they're tied to structural elements of your day. The psychological effect of completing a habit stack can also reinforce the behavior. Each step in the sequence provides a small sense of accomplishment. You poured your coffee. You wrote in your journal. You reviewed your goals. By the time you're done, you've completed 3 intentional actions, and it's not even 8 in the morning. That sense of momentum and achievement can positively influence the rest of your day. You've demonstrated to yourself that you can follow through on intentions, which builds self-efficacy. That confidence can spill over into other areas. The concept of habit stacking has roots in behavioral chaining, a technique used in applied behavior analysis. Behavioral chaining involves teaching complex behaviors by breaking them into smaller steps and linking those steps together. Each step serves as the discriminative stimulus for the next step. This is how animals are trained to perform elaborate tricks and how people with cognitive impairments learn self-care routines. The principles are the same. You establish each link in the chain through repetition and reinforcement, and eventually the entire chain runs smoothly. In habit formation, the reinforcement often comes from the natural consequences of the behavior rather than external rewards. Stretching feels good. Reviewing your goals provides clarity. Writing in your journal creates a sense of reflection. These intrinsic rewards strengthen the behavior over time. But in the early stages, when the behavior isn't yet automatic, it can be helpful to add external reinforcement. You might track your completion of the habit stack on a calendar, or allow yourself a small reward after finishing the sequence. The external reinforcement supports the behavior until the intrinsic rewards become sufficient on their own. Some people find it useful to create physical reminders that support their habit stacks. If your stack involves taking vitamins after breakfast, you might place the vitamin bottle next to your coffee maker so it's visible when you pour your morning coffee. The physical cue reinforces the behavioral cue. You're using environmental design to support the sequence. This combination of behavioral and environmental cueing is often more powerful than either approach alone. Habit stacking can also be used to replace unwanted behaviors. If you have a habit of checking your phone immediately after waking up, you can create a stack that redirects that impulse. After I turn off my alarm, I will place my phone across the room. After I place my phone across the room, I will do 10 deep breaths. After I do 10 deep breaths, I will get out of bed. You're not trying to eliminate the initial impulse. You're channeling it into a different sequence. The anchor, turning off your alarm, remains the same. But the routine that follows has been redesigned. The effectiveness of this approach depends on your ability to interrupt the old sequence before it completes. If you turn off your alarm and immediately reach for your phone, the old habit wins. But if you can catch yourself in that moment and redirect to the new sequence, you're gradually overriding the old pattern. This requires awareness and effort initially, but it becomes easier with repetition. The new sequence starts to compete with the old one, and eventually, if you're consistent, it can become the dominant pattern. Habit stacking is not a magic solution. It requires the same fundamental elements as any habit formation strategy: repetition, consistency, and time. But it provides a structure that makes repetition and consistency more achievable. By anchoring new behaviors to existing ones, you're working with your brain's natural tendency to automate sequences rather than fighting against it. You're building on what already works instead of trying to create something entirely new from scratch. Every behavior you perform requires effort. Some behaviors demand more effort than others, and your brain is constantly calculating whether the effort is worth the potential reward. This calculation happens largely outside conscious awareness, but it profoundly influences what you do and don't do. The technical term for this is effort discounting. The more steps required to perform a behavior, the more effort it demands, and the less likely you are to do it. Conversely, the fewer steps required, the less effort it demands, and the more likely you are to follow through. This principle has straightforward implications for behavior change. If you want to increase the likelihood of performing a desired behavior, you reduce the friction associated with it. If you want to decrease the likelihood of performing an undesired behavior, you increase the friction. Friction here refers to the number of steps, the amount of time, the level of physical or cognitive effort, or any other barrier that stands between you and the behavior. This approach is sometimes called friction design, and it's one of the most practical tools for changing habits without relying on willpower. Consider a simple example. If you want to eat more fruit, you could keep fruit in a bowl on your kitchen counter. The fruit is visible, accessible, and ready to eat. The friction is minimal. You see it, you grab it, you eat it. But if the fruit is in the back of the refrigerator in a drawer, unwashed and uncut, the friction is higher. You have to open the fridge, find the drawer, take out the fruit, wash it, possibly peel or cut it, and then eat it. Each of those steps is a small barrier, but they accumulate. When you're hungry and deciding what to eat, your brain compares the effort required for different options. The fruit in the drawer loses to the crackers in the cupboard because the crackers require less effort. The same logic applies in reverse. If you want to eat fewer crackers, you could stop buying them entirely, which eliminates the option, or you could put them in a hard-to-reach place, like a high shelf or a basement storage area. Now accessing the crackers requires extra steps. You have to get a stool or you have to go downstairs. The friction has increased. You might still eat the crackers sometimes, but you'll eat them less often because the effort required creates a moment of hesitation. In that moment, you might decide it's not worth it, or you might choose something else that's easier to access. This is not about self-control in the traditional sense. You're not resisting the crackers through sheer willpower. You're changing the conditions under which the decision is made. The crackers are still available, but the increased effort shifts the calculation. The behavior becomes less automatic and more deliberate. And because most habitual behaviors rely on automaticity, adding friction disrupts the habit loop. Research on choice architecture demonstrates how powerfully environmental structure influences behavior. In one well-known study, researchers examined food selection in cafeterias. When healthier options were placed at eye level and less healthy options were placed lower or higher on the shelves, people chose the healthier options more frequently. When the positions were reversed, the less healthy options were chosen more often. The people in the study weren't consciously deciding based on shelf position. They were simply reaching for what was easiest to see and access. The environment guided the behavior. The same principle applies to digital environments. If you want to reduce the time you spend on social media, you can delete the apps from your phone. Now accessing social media requires opening a web browser, typing in the URL, and logging in. That's several additional steps compared to tapping an app icon. The friction reduces impulse usage. You might still use social media, but you'll use it less frequently and more intentionally, because the effort required gives you a moment to consider whether it's really what you want to do. Alternatively, you could keep the apps, but move them off your home screen into a folder several pages deep. Or you could enable settings that require a password every time you open the app. Each of these modifications adds friction. None of them makes the behavior impossible, but they make it less automatic. And because automatic behaviors are the ones most resistant to conscious control, reducing automaticity is often more effective than trying to control the behavior through willpower alone. The inverse strategy, reducing friction, is equally powerful. If you want to exercise more, you can lay out your workout clothes the night before. In the morning, the clothes are right there. You don't have to think about what to wear or search through drawers. The behavior becomes easier, and easier behaviors are more likely to happen. If you want to drink more water, you can carry a water bottle with you everywhere. The water is always accessible. You don't have to find a fountain or go to the kitchen. The reduced friction increases the frequency of the behavior. Some of the most effective friction modifications are those that operate at the point of decision. If you want to stop checking your phone during meals, you can establish a rule that phones go in another room during dinner. The friction, walking to another room, creates a barrier at the moment of impulse. Most impulses are short-lived. If you can delay the behavior even briefly, the impulse often passes. The friction provides that delay. There's a concept in behavioral economics called present bias, which describes the tendency to overvalue immediate rewards and undervalue future consequences. Present bias is why people struggle with behaviors that have delayed benefits. Exercise is hard now, and the benefits come later. Eating junk food is pleasurable now, and the consequences come later. Your brain naturally gravitates toward the immediate experience. Friction design can counteract present bias by altering the immediate experience. If the healthy behavior is easy and the unhealthy behavior is hard, you've shifted the immediate calculation in favor of the long-term benefit. This doesn't eliminate present bias, but it changes the terms of the decision. You're not trying to convince yourself that future benefits are worth present effort. You're making the present effort smaller for desired behaviors and larger for undesired ones. The future benefits remain the same, but the immediate cost-benefit ratio has changed. Environmental restructuring based on friction design can be surprisingly simple. Some examples. If you want to read more books, place a book on your pillow in the morning so it's there when you get into bed at night. If you want to stop watching television before bed, unplug the television and put the remote in a drawer. If you want to meditate daily, create a dedicated space with a cushion that's always set up and ready. If you want to stop snacking while working, don't keep snacks at your desk. Each of these changes is small, but small changes in friction can produce significant changes in behavior over time. The cumulative effect is what matters. One instance of increased friction might not change much, but if that friction is present every single day, it adds up. Over weeks and months, the high-friction behavior becomes rare and the low-friction behavior becomes common. The environment is doing the work that willpower would otherwise have to do. There are limits to this approach. Some behaviors can't be made low-friction because they're inherently demanding. Running a marathon requires substantial effort no matter how you structure the environment. But even inherently demanding behaviors can be made less frictionful at the initiation point. You can't make the marathon easy, but you can make putting on your running shoes easy. And once your shoes are on, you're more likely to start running. The initiation is often the highest friction moment. If you can reduce friction there, the rest of the behavior becomes more likely, even if it remains difficult. Another limitation is that people can adapt to friction. If you put the crackers on a high shelf, you might initially eat fewer crackers, but over time, you might get used to retrieving them from the high shelf, and the behavior returns to its previous frequency. The friction loses its effectiveness because it's no longer novel or inconvenient. To maintain the effect, you might need to periodically increase the friction further or change the type of friction you're using. The concept of the path of least resistance is central to friction design. Human behavior naturally follows the path of least resistance unless there's a strong reason to do otherwise. If you want to change behavior, you make the desired behavior the path of least resistance. This doesn't mean eliminating all challenges or making life effortless. It means strategically arranging your environment so that the behaviors aligned with your goals are easier than the behaviors that undermine them. Some friction is invisible until you look for it. You might not realize that the reason you don't use a particular kitchen appliance is that it's stored in a cupboard that requires moving other items to access. The effort feels trivial in the abstract, but in the moment when you're deciding what to make for dinner, that small friction is enough to make you choose a different option. Identifying and eliminating invisible friction can unlock behaviors you thought you'd abandoned. The same applies to adding friction to unwanted behaviors. You might not consciously notice that you check your email dozens of times a day until you log out of your email account and have to log back in each time. Suddenly, the behavior becomes visible because there's a friction point. You start to notice how often you are doing it automatically. The friction creates awareness, and awareness creates an opportunity for choice. Digital tools can be designed with friction in mind. Some apps include features that make you wait 30 seconds before you can access certain content, or they require you to type out a phrase explaining why you're opening the app. These are artificial friction points designed to interrupt automatic behavior. They don't prevent the behavior, but they introduce a pause. In that pause, you have the opportunity to reconsider. Commitment devices are a form of preemptive friction. You make a decision now that constrains your options later. If you give your credit card to a friend and ask them not to return it until the end of the month, you've created friction around spending. You can still spend, but it requires asking for the card back, which is awkward and effortful. That friction reduces impulsive purchases.
The commitment device works because it increases friction at the point of action while your motivation is low, based on a decision you made when your motivation was high. The effectiveness of friction design depends on correctly identifying the points of highest leverage. Not all friction is equally impactful. Adding friction to a step that you rarely think about won't change much, but adding friction to a step that's part of an automatic sequence can disrupt the entire habit. The key is to analyze the behavior carefully, identify where the automatic trigger occurs, and add friction at that specific point. This requires some self-awareness. You need to understand your own behavioral patterns well enough to know where the friction will be most effective. For some people, the highest leverage point is the moment they walk in the door after work. That's when they decide whether to change into workout clothes or collapse on the couch. For others, it's the moment they wake up or the moment they finish a meal. The leverage point varies by person and by behavior. Once you've identified the leverage point, the friction modification should be as simple as possible. Complexity introduces its own friction. If your system for reducing phone usage requires installing 3 apps, configuring multiple settings, and remembering a series of passwords, you probably won't maintain it. The best friction modifications are those that require one-time setup and then operate automatically thereafter. Identity is not just a label you apply to yourself. It's a framework through which your brain interprets behavior. When an action aligns with your sense of who you are, it feels natural and requires less cognitive effort to maintain. When an action conflicts with your identity, it feels forced and demands ongoing justification. This is why 2 people can perform the same behavior with vastly different levels of difficulty. One person sees the behavior as consistent with their identity, and the other sees it as something they're making themselves do. Research on self-concept and behavior shows that people are motivated to act in ways that confirm their beliefs about themselves. This isn't necessarily conscious. You don't wake up each morning and explicitly decide to behave in accordance with your identity. The process is more subtle. Your identity shapes what feels right, what feels like you. And behaviors that feel like you are easier to perform and more likely to persist than behaviors that feel like obligations or experiments. Consider the difference between someone who says, "I'm trying to be a runner," and someone who says, "I'm a runner." The first statement positions running as something external, an activity the person is attempting to adopt but hasn't fully integrated. The second statement positions running as part of the person's identity. When someone identifies as a runner, skipping a run creates dissonance. It conflicts with their self-concept. That dissonance generates internal pressure to get back to running. Not because of external accountability or willpower, but because not running feels inconsistent with who they are. This internal consistency motivation is powerful because it doesn't deplete the way willpower does. Willpower requires you to override your impulses. Identity-based behavior feels like following your impulses, or at least following your nature. There's no battle between what you want to do and what you think you should do. The identity aligns the two. The mechanism behind this involves self-schema, which are cognitive structures that organize information about the self. When you adopt an identity, you create or strengthen a self-schema related to that identity. That schema influences what you pay attention to, how you interpret events, and what behaviors feel appropriate. If you identify as a healthy person, you're more likely to notice information about nutrition and exercise. You're more likely to interpret a friend's invitation to go hiking as appealing rather than burdensome. You're more likely to choose a salad over fries, not because you're forcing yourself, but because that's what healthy people do, and you're a healthy person. Self-schemas also influence memory. People remember information that's consistent with their self-concept more easily than information that's inconsistent.
If you identify as someone who's good with money, you'll more readily recall instances where you made smart financial decisions. Those memories reinforce the identity, which in turn reinforces the behaviors associated with it. The process becomes self-perpetuating. The challenge is that identity change doesn't happen instantly. You can't simply decide to be a runner or a writer or a healthy person and have the identity immediately take hold. Identity forms through accumulated evidence. Your brain looks at your behavior and uses it to infer who you are. If you run regularly, your brain concludes that you're a runner. If you write regularly, your brain concludes that you're a writer. The behavior comes first. The identity follows. This creates a paradox. You need the behavior to form the identity, but the identity makes the behavior easier. The solution is to start with small, consistent actions that provide evidence for the identity you want to adopt. You don't need to run marathons to be a runner. You just need to run regularly, even if it's short distances. Each run is a vote for the identity. Over time, the votes accumulate and the identity solidifies. The concept of identity-based habits was popularized by behavior change researchers who noticed that people who successfully maintained long-term behavior changes often experienced a shift in self-concept. They stopped seeing the behavior as something they were doing and started seeing it as an expression of who they were. This shift marked a transition from effortful maintenance to automatic sustainability. The identity doesn't have to be grandiose. You don't need to identify as an elite athlete. Identifying as someone who moves their body daily is sufficient. You don't need to identify as a best-selling author. Identifying as someone who writes is enough. The specificity matters less than the alignment. As long as the behavior is consistent with the identity will support the behavior. Some identities are more helpful than others. An identity that's too narrow or too extreme can create problems. If you identify as someone who never eats sugar, you've created a rigid standard that's difficult to maintain. A single lapse feels like a complete identity failure, which can trigger a cascade of additional lapses. Because if you've already failed to be who you are, why bother continuing to try? A more flexible identity, like someone who generally makes healthy food choices, allows for occasional deviations without triggering an identity crisis. The language you use to describe yourself influences identity formation. Internal narratives matter. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "I'm not a morning person," you're reinforcing an identity that makes early rising feel unnatural. If you shift the narrative to, "I'm someone who's learning to appreciate mornings," you've created space for the behavior to develop without immediately conflicting with your identity. The identity isn't fixed. It's in transition. The behavior doesn't have to prove anything. It's part of an ongoing process. There's evidence that public commitment to an identity can strengthen it, though this cuts both ways. Telling people you're a runner creates social accountability. Other people now expect you to run, and you expect yourself to live up to the identity you've claimed. This can be motivating, but it can also create pressure and make failure more painful. If you publicly claim an identity and then don't live up to it, the social cost is higher than if you'd kept the identity private. The safer approach might be to start with private identity work and share it publicly only once the behavior is relatively stable. Let the identity develop through consistent action, and once it feels genuine, then invite social reinforcement. This reduces the risk of premature commitment, where you claim an identity before you've accumulated enough behavioral evidence to support it. Some research suggests that focusing on the type of person you want to become is more effective than focusing on specific outcomes you want to achieve. Outcome goals like lose 20 pounds or write a novel are finite. Once you achieve them, the motivation ends. Identity goals like become a healthy person or become a writer are ongoing. There's no finish line. The behavior continues because it's part of who you are, not because you're working toward a specific target. This doesn't mean outcome goals are useless. They can provide direction and milestones, but they work best when they're nested within a broader identity framework. You want to lose 20 pounds because you're becoming a healthy person. You want to write a novel because you're becoming a writer. The outcome serves the identity rather than replacing it. Identity-based motivation is particularly useful for maintaining behavior during difficult periods. When motivation is high and conditions are favorable, almost any strategy works. But when life gets stressful, when you're tired or discouraged, outcome-based motivation often collapses. The goal feels distant or irrelevant. Identity-based motivation is more resilient because it's not contingent on external conditions. You're not running because you feel great. You're running because you're a runner. That's what runners do. This can sound almost tautological, but the psychological effect is real. The identity provides a stable reference point when everything else is in flux. It answers the question of why you should bother when you don't feel like it. The answer is, because this is who you are. The concept extends beyond individual behaviors to clusters of related behaviors. If you identify as a disciplined person, multiple behaviors become easier because they all fit under that identity umbrella. Exercising, eating well, managing finances, showing up on time, these might seem like separate challenges, but under the identity of discipline, they're all expressions of the same underlying self-concept. Strengthening the identity in one domain can support behaviors in other domains. There's a risk here as well. If you identify as disciplined and then fail to act in a disciplined way, the dissonance can be destabilizing. You might respond by doubling down on the behavior, which is the desired outcome. Or you might respond by revising the identity downward, concluding that you're not actually disciplined after all. This is why it's important to build identity gradually, based on actual behavioral evidence rather than aspirational statements. Cultural and social contexts also shape which identities feel available or desirable. Some identities carry social capital, others carry stigma. If you grow up in an environment where intellectualism is mocked, adopting an identity as a reader or a scholar might feel socially risky. If you grow up in an environment where physical fitness is highly valued, adopting an identity as an athlete might feel natural and supported. The broader social context doesn't determine your identity, but it influences which identities require more effort to claim and maintain. One practical application of identity-based behavior change is to explicitly articulate the identity you're working toward and then ask yourself, with each decision, what would a person with that identity do in this situation? This isn't about faking it until you make it. It's about using the aspirational identity as a decision-making heuristic. The more often you choose the action consistent with the identity, the more evidence you accumulate, and the more the identity becomes genuine rather than aspirational. The transition from aspirational to actual is gradual and often imperceptible. You don't wake up one day suddenly feeling like a different person. It's more that you look back after months of consistent behavior and realize the identity has settled in. You no longer think about whether you're a runner. You just know you are because you run. And you've been running for long enough that the behavior and the identity are integrated. This integration reduces the cognitive load associated with the behavior. You're not negotiating with yourself every time the behavior comes up. You're not weighing pros and cons or mustering motivation. The behavior is simply what you do because it's who you are. That automaticity, grounded in identity rather than just repetition, may be one of the most durable forms of habit. It's resistant to disruption because abandoning the behavior would mean abandoning a piece of yourself, and people are generally reluctant to do that. Most behaviors don't deliver their benefits immediately. Exercise makes you tired now and healthier later. Studying is effortful now and pays off during the exam. Saving money means less spending power today and more financial security tomorrow. This temporal gap between effort and reward creates a problem for habit formation because the brain's reward system is designed to respond to immediate feedback. Dopamine spikes when rewards arrive quickly. When rewards are delayed, the dopamine response is weaker and the behavior is less likely to be repeated automatically. Temptation bundling is a strategy that addresses this problem by pairing a behavior that's good for you in the long term with something that's immediately pleasurable. You take the delayed benefit behavior and attach an instant reward to it. The result is that the brain experiences immediate positive feedback, which strengthens the habit loop, while you still accumulate the long-term benefits of the productive behavior. The term comes from research by behavioral economist Katie Milkman, who studied what happened when people were only allowed to listen to entertaining audiobooks while exercising at the gym. The audiobooks were the temptation, something immediately enjoyable. The exercise was the beneficial but less immediately rewarding behavior. By bundling the two together, the immediate pleasure of the audiobook became associated with the gym. People started looking forward to their workouts, not because exercise itself became more enjoyable, but because the workout was now the only time they could indulge in their favorite story. The results showed that people who used temptation bundling visited the gym more frequently than those who could listen to their audiobooks anytime. The bundling created a new incentive structure. Going to the gym wasn't just about future health benefits anymore. It was also about immediate entertainment. The brain's reward circuitry responded to the immediate pleasure, which made the behavior easier to repeat and more likely to become habitual. The mechanism here involves hijacking the dopamine system. The audiobook triggers dopamine release. The brain associates that release with the entire experience, which includes the exercise. Over time, even the anticipation of going to the gym can start to feel rewarding because the brain predicts the pleasure that's coming. This is the same process that turns neutral cues into craving triggers in habit formation, but it's being used deliberately to support a beneficial behavior. The key to effective temptation bundling is that the temptation must be genuinely pleasurable, and the pairing must be exclusive. If you allow yourself to listen to the audiobook anywhere, anytime, it loses its power as a bundled incentive. The restriction is what creates the association. You can only have the immediate reward when you perform the desired behavior. This exclusivity makes the desired behavior more attractive because it's now the gateway to something you want right now. This works for a wide range of behavior pairings. You might allow yourself to watch a favorite show only while doing household chores. You might enjoy a premium coffee only during your morning writing session. You might listen to a particular podcast only during your commute if you're trying to make commuting feel less burdensome. The immediate pleasure doesn't have to be elaborate. It just has to be something you genuinely enjoy and something you're willing to restrict to the context of the target behavior. There's a concept in behavioral economics called present bias, the tendency to overweight immediate outcomes relative to future ones. Temptation bundling doesn't eliminate present bias, it leverages it. Instead of fighting your brain's preference for immediate rewards, you're satisfying that preference while also pursuing long-term goals.
The immediate pleasure provides the motivation that the distant benefit can't supply on its own. The effectiveness of temptation bundling varies depending on how well matched the temptation is to the difficulty of the behavior. If the behavior is mildly unpleasant and the temptation is highly enjoyable, the pairing works well. If the behavior is extremely aversive and the temptation is only moderately enjoyable, the pairing might not be strong enough to overcome the resistance. The temptation needs to be compelling enough to shift the immediate cost-benefit calculation in favor of doing the behavior. One limitation is that not all behaviors are compatible with simultaneous temptations. You can listen to music while exercising, but you can't watch a visually demanding show while reading a book. The activities would interfere with each other. Effective temptation bundling requires finding activities that can coexist without one undermining the other. This usually means pairing a cognitively demanding task with a passive pleasure, or pairing a physically demanding task with a mental pleasure. Another consideration is that the temptation itself should ideally be something that doesn't create new problems. Bundling exercise with eating candy would provide immediate pleasure, but it would also undermine the health benefits of exercising. The temptation should be neutral or positive in its own right. Entertainment, music, social interaction, pleasant environments. These are temptations that enhance the experience without creating negative side effects. Some people worry that temptation bundling makes them dependent on external rewards and prevents intrinsic motivation from developing. The concern is that if you only exercise because you get to listen to audiobooks, you'll never learn to enjoy exercise for its own sake. This is a reasonable concern, but the research suggests it's not usually a problem in practice. The bundling serves as scaffolding during the early stages of habit formation, when the behavior feels difficult and motivation is fragile. Over time, as the behavior becomes more automatic, and as you start experiencing the intrinsic benefits, the external reward becomes less necessary. In many cases, people continue the bundling because it's enjoyable, not because they need it to maintain the behavior. The audiobook makes the workout more pleasant, but even without it, the person would still exercise because the habit is now established and the intrinsic benefits have become apparent. The bundling doesn't prevent intrinsic motivation from developing. It just provides support while intrinsic motivation is still weak. There's also a version of temptation bundling that involves social rewards. If you perform a behavior with other people and the social interaction is enjoyable, the social pleasure becomes bundled with the behavior. This is part of why group exercise classes, study groups, and accountability partnerships can be effective. The immediate reward is the social connection, the conversation, the shared experience. That reward arrives instantly, even though the benefits of the primary behavior might be delayed. This social version of temptation bundling is particularly powerful because humans are deeply social creatures. Social connection activates reward circuits in the brain as strongly as food or other primary rewards. If you can bundle a desired behavior with positive social interaction, you're tapping into one of the most potent sources of immediate motivation available. The concept of incentive compatibility is related to temptation bundling. Incentive. Compatibility means structuring a situation so that doing what's good for you in the long term also feels good in the short term. The incentives are aligned rather than in conflict. Most behavior change advice assumes that your short-term and long-term interests are opposed, that you have to sacrifice now to benefit later. Temptation bundling rejects that assumption. It looks for ways to make the present and future align, to make the right choice also the immediately rewarding choice.
This alignment doesn't always require adding a new temptation. Sometimes it involves reframing the behavior so you notice the immediate rewards that are already there, but that you've been overlooking. Exercise doesn't just make you healthier in the future. It also makes you feel more energized within hours. Healthy eating doesn't just prevent disease decades from now. It also improves your mood and energy levels today. If you pay attention to these immediate benefits and consciously connect them to the behavior, you're creating a form of natural temptation bundling. The behavior is already rewarding in the short term. You're just learning to recognize and savor those rewards. The strategy can be applied to breaking bad habits as well, though in a different way. If you want to stop a behavior, you can bundle that cessation with an immediate reward. For example, if you're trying to quit smoking, you might put the money you would have spent on cigarettes into a jar and use it to buy something you want at the end of each week. The immediate visual reward of seeing the money accumulate, plus the weekly purchase, provides short-term positive feedback that reinforces the decision not to smoke. This isn't exactly temptation bundling in the original sense, but it's based on the same principle. Make the desired behavior immediately rewarding. The difficulty with breaking habits is that stopping a behavior often removes a source of immediate pleasure without replacing it. Temptation bundling or similar strategies can fill that gap by providing an alternative source of immediate reward. Some researchers distinguish between wanting and liking. Wanting is the motivational drive, the pursuit of a reward. Liking is the pleasure experienced when the reward is obtained. Temptation bundling works because it provides something to like immediately, which increases wanting for the bundled activity. The gym becomes something you want to go to because you like the audiobook. And the audiobook is only available at the gym. The wanting and liking are now connected to the same behavior package. Over time, other sources of liking can develop. You might start to like how you feel after exercising. You might start to like the sense of accomplishment. You might start to like the physical changes you notice. These new sources of liking can eventually become stronger than the original temptation. The audiobook brought you to the gym, but the intrinsic rewards of exercise keep you there. The bundling served its purpose by getting you over the initial hump when intrinsic motivation was insufficient. The application of temptation bundling doesn't require perfection. You don't need to find the ideal pairing or maintain absolute exclusivity. Even a loose association between a pleasant activity and a beneficial behavior can shift the motivational calculus enough to make the difference between doing the behavior sporadically and doing it consistently. Consistency is what creates habits, and habits are what make behavior sustainable without ongoing effort. Temptation bundling is simply a tool to establish that consistency during the vulnerable early period when the habit hasn't yet taken root. Stopping a behavior is neurologically different from starting one. When you try to suppress a habit, you're asking your brain to interrupt an automatic sequence that's already encoded. This requires active inhibition, a process managed primarily by the prefrontal cortex. Inhibition is cognitively expensive. It demands attention, depletes mental resources, and becomes increasingly difficult to maintain over time. This is why pure suppression, trying not to do something, so often fails. You're fighting against an automatic program with a system that wasn't designed for sustained resistance. The neuroscience of inhibitory control reveals why this approach is so unreliable. When you encounter a cue that normally triggers a habitual behavior, the basal ganglia begins to initiate the motor and cognitive sequence associated with that habit. The sequence starts unfolding automatically. To stop it, the prefrontal cortex has to send inhibitory signals that override the basal ganglia's commands. This works, but it's effortful. It's like trying to stop a train that's already in motion, rather than preventing it from leaving the station. Brain imaging studies show that successful inhibition activates regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with cognitive control, particularly the right inferior frontal gyrus and the anterior cingulate cortex. These regions monitor for conflicts between automatic responses and conscious goals. When they detect a conflict, they apply the brakes. But this braking system has limits. It can handle occasional demands, but it struggles under constant pressure. If you're trying to inhibit the same impulse dozens of times per day, the system fatigues. Inhibitory control declines as cognitive resources are depleted, which is why people often fail at resisting habits when they're tired, stressed, or mentally overloaded. This depletion effect has been studied extensively in research on ego depletion and self-control. While some aspects of this research have been debated, the core finding remains robust. Exerting self-control in one domain reduces your capacity for self-control in other domains, at least temporarily. If you spend the morning resisting the urge to check your phone, you'll have less inhibitory capacity available to resist unhealthy snacks in the afternoon. The prefrontal cortex is working with finite resources. The alternative to pure suppression is habit replacement. Instead of trying to stop the automatic behavior, you redirect it. When the cue appears and the basal ganglia initiates the habitual sequence, you intercept it and substitute a different behavior. This still requires some inhibitory control, but significantly less than complete suppression. You're not fighting the urge to act, you're channeling it into a different action. The classic example involves smoking cessation. People who try to quit by simply not smoking whenever they feel the urge are using pure suppression. The urge appears, they resist it, and they experience the full force of the craving until it passes. This is exhausting and often unsuccessful. People who replace smoking with a different behavior, chewing, gum, deep breathing, taking a walk, are still responding to the urge, but they're redirecting it. The urge appears, they perform an alternative behavior, and the urge is partially satisfied by the act of doing something. The replacement behavior isn't as rewarding as smoking, but it's enough to reduce the intensity of the craving and provide a sense of control. This works because the brain is better at switching between actions than at completely inhibiting action. The neural pathways for switching are more efficient than the pathways for suppression. When you suppress a behavior, you're essentially holding the automatic program in check while doing nothing, which creates internal tension. When you replace a behavior, you're allowing action to occur, just directing it toward a different target. The action itself relieves some of the motivational pressure. Research on habit reversal training demonstrates this principle. Originally developed to treat conditions like tics and compulsive behaviors, habit reversal training teaches people to recognize the early warning signs of a habitual behavior and to immediately perform a competing response. If someone has a habit of nail biting, they learn to recognize the moment when their hand starts moving toward their mouth and to immediately clench their fist or sit on their hand instead. The competing response physically prevents the unwanted behavior while providing an outlet for the urge. The effectiveness of this approach depends on selecting a replacement behavior that's incompatible with the unwanted behavior and that provides some degree of satisfaction. The replacement doesn't have to be as satisfying as the original behavior, but it can't be completely unrewarding, or you won't stick with it. It needs to occupy the same behavioral slot in a way that feels like a genuine alternative rather than a punishment. One framework for habit replacement involves identifying the actual reward the original behavior provides and finding a healthier way to obtain that reward. If you eat cookies every afternoon because you're seeking an energy boost, the replacement behavior should also provide energy. That might be a brief walk, a healthy snack, or a conversation with a colleague. The replacement targets the same underlying need, which makes it a more viable substitute than a behavior that doesn't address the need at all. This is where understanding the habit loop becomes critical. The cue triggers the behavior, and the behavior provides a reward. If you only focus on stopping the behavior without addressing the reward, you've left a gap. The brain still wants the reward. It will seek alternative ways to get it, and those alternatives might be just as problematic as the original behavior. But if you identify what reward the behavior was providing and find a replacement that delivers a similar reward, you've created a sustainable alternative. The challenge is that the original behavior often provides multiple rewards simultaneously, and not all of them are obvious. Smoking provides nicotine, which is physiologically rewarding, but it also provides a break from work, a moment of solitude, a reason to step outside, and possibly social interaction with other smokers. A replacement behavior that only addresses the nicotine, like a nicotine patch, misses the other rewards. A more effective replacement would need to incorporate the break, the change of scenery, and possibly the social element. This might look like taking a 5-minute walk outside with a colleague, which provides many of the same rewards without the smoking. The brain doesn't distinguish between healthy and unhealthy ways of obtaining a reward. It just tracks what works. If you remove one source of reward without providing an alternative, the brain experiences deprivation, which increases craving and makes relapse more likely. But if you provide an alternative source, the brain can adapt. Craving diminishes because the underlying need is still being met. There's also a neural phenomenon called extinction, which is what happens when a behavior is repeatedly performed without receiving its expected reward. If you smoke but don't experience the usual satisfaction, the behavior gradually weakens. The association between the cue and the behavior erodes. But extinction is slow and incomplete. The neural pathways don't disappear. They become dormant. This is why people who quit smoking can experience cravings years later when they encounter familiar cues. The old association is still there, just suppressed. Replacement accelerates extinction of the unwanted behavior while simultaneously building a new association. Each time you perform the replacement behavior instead of the unwanted one, you're weakening the old pathway and strengthening a new one. Over time, the replacement becomes the automatic response to the cue. The old behavior doesn't completely disappear from neural memory, but it's no longer the dominant pattern. The timing of the replacement matters. It needs to occur as close as possible to the moment when the urge or cue appears. If there's a long gap between the cue and the replacement, you're not creating a direct association. The brain doesn't connect them into a new habit loop. But if the replacement immediately follows the cue, the association forms quickly. This is why awareness of the cue is essential. You need to recognize the trigger as it's happening so you can implement the replacement in real time. Some habits are more difficult to replace than others. Habits that provide strong physiological rewards, like those involving addictive substances, are harder to replace because the replacement behavior typically can't match the intensity of the original reward. Habits that provide primarily psychological or social rewards are often easier to replace because alternative behaviors can deliver similar psychological or social benefits. The concept of response prevention is related but distinct. In response prevention, you physically prevent yourself from performing the unwanted behavior, often as a temporary measure while working on replacement strategies. If you're trying to stop checking your phone compulsively, you might leave it in another room during certain hours. This prevents the behavior entirely, which gives you practice experiencing the urge without acting on it. Over time, the urge diminishes through extinction. Response prevention is useful, but it's usually more effective when combined with replacement than when used alone. Another factor in successful habit interruption is addressing the emotional and situational triggers that activate the behavior. Many habits are triggered by specific emotional states: stress, boredom, anxiety, loneliness. If you can identify the emotional trigger and address it directly, the behavior becomes less necessary. This might involve stress management techniques, social connection, or therapy, depending on the underlying issue. The habit was serving a function. If you can meet that function through healthier means, the habit loses its purpose. The process of breaking a habit through replacement isn't linear. There will be lapses. The old behavior will resurface, especially during high-stress periods or when cognitive resources are low. These lapses don't erase progress. The neural pathway for the replacement behavior doesn't disappear just because you occasionally revert to the old one. What matters is the overall pattern. If you're performing the replacement behavior more often than the old behavior, you're moving in the right direction. The goal is progress, not perfection. Behavior is contagious. The people around you shape what you do in ways that operate largely outside your conscious awareness. This isn't about peer pressure in the traditional sense, the explicit urging or forcing of behavior. It's about something more fundamental. Your brain is constantly observing the actions of others and using that information to calibrate what's normal, what's expected, and what's safe. When the people around you perform a behavior regularly, your brain registers that behavior as typical for your social environment. And behaviors that feel typical require less justification, less deliberation, and less cognitive effort to perform. The mechanism behind social contagion involves several neural systems working together. One key component is the mirror neuron system, networks of neurons that activate both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action. Mirror neurons were first discovered in monkeys, but substantial evidence suggests humans have analogous systems, particularly in motor and premotor cortex regions. When you watch someone lift a cup, neurons involved in lifting movements become active in your own brain, even though you're not moving. This neural mirroring creates a form of motor simulation, a vicarious experience of the observed action. This simulation isn't just passive observation, it primes your own behavior. When you've just watched someone perform an action, you're more likely to perform that action yourself because the relevant neural pathways are already activated. The threshold for initiating the behavior is temporarily lowered. This is part of why yawning is contagious, why laughter spreads through groups, and why seeing someone reach for food makes you more likely to eat even if you weren't hungry moments before. Beyond immediate imitation, there's a broader process of social learning through observation. You don't need to be explicitly taught a behavior to learn it. You can acquire complex behavioral patterns simply by watching others and noting the consequences. If you observe someone performing a behavior and receiving positive outcomes, your brain encodes that behavior as potentially rewarding. If you observe negative outcomes, the behavior is encoded as risky. This observational learning allows you to benefit from others' experiences without having to directly experience the consequences yourself. Albert Bandura's social learning theory, developed in the 1960s, demonstrated this through studies where children observed adults interacting with a toy. Children who saw adults behaving aggressively toward the toy were significantly more likely to behave aggressively themselves when given access to the same toy. The children weren't instructed to be aggressive. They simply replicated what they'd observed because observation created a behavioral template. The same principle applies to habit formation. If you're surrounded by people who exercise regularly, you're more likely to exercise. If you're surrounded by people who read, you're more likely to read. If you're surrounded by people who eat healthily, you're more likely to make healthy food choices. The behaviors you observe become normalized in your perception, and normalized behaviors feel easier to adopt. You're not fighting against social norms, you're following them. This is where the concept of social proof becomes relevant. Social proof is the psychological phenomenon where people look to others' behavior to determine appropriate action, especially in ambiguous situations. If you're unsure whether something is a good idea, you check what other people are doing. If most people are doing it, you assume it's probably reasonable. If nobody's doing it, you assume there might be a reason to avoid it. This heuristic usually works well because groups collectively have more information than individuals. But it also means your behavior is heavily influenced by group norms, even when those norms aren't optimal. Research on social norms shows that people consistently underestimate how much their behavior is influenced by others. When asked, most people claim their choices are based on personal preference or rational decision-making. But experimental studies reveal that even subtle social cues significantly shift behavior. In one study, hotel guests were more likely to reuse towels when signs indicated that most previous guests had done so. The behavior of strangers they'd never met influenced their actions. Similar effects have been found with energy conservation, voting behavior, and health decisions. The influence is strongest when the observed behavior comes from people you identify with or people you perceive as similar to yourself. If you see someone your age, your gender, from your cultural background performing a behavior, it has more impact than seeing someone from a very different demographic. The brain interprets similarity as relevance. If someone like you does it, it must be something people like you do. This makes that behavior feel appropriate and accessible. Social contagion operates through networks. You're not just influenced by the people you interact with directly. You're also influenced by their connections, by the friends of your friends, and even by people several degrees removed from you. Network studies on obesity, smoking, and happiness have found that these states spread through social networks in measurable patterns. If your friend becomes obese, your risk of becoming obese increases. If your friend's friend becomes obese, your risk still increases, though less dramatically. The effect extends up to 3 degrees of separation before it becomes negligible. This doesn't mean obesity or smoking are directly transmitted like viruses. It means behaviors and norms spread through networks, and those behaviors influence outcomes. If the people around you normalize larger portion sizes, sedentary lifestyles, or frequent snacking, those norms shape your environment and your choices. The effect is statistical, not deterministic. You're not guaranteed to adopt the behavior, but the probability increases measurably. The practical implication is that changing your social environment can be one of the most powerful tools for changing your own behavior. If you want to develop a new habit, surrounding yourself with people who already practice that habit makes adoption significantly easier. You're leveraging social contagion deliberately. The behavior you want to adopt becomes normal in your immediate environment, which reduces the cognitive effort required to maintain it. This is part of why group-based interventions are often more effective than individual ones. Weight loss programs that include group meetings show better long-term success than programs where individuals work alone. The group creates a micro-environment where the desired behaviors are normalized. Members observe each other's successes, share strategies, and reinforce the identity of being someone who's working on health. The social context supports the behavior in ways that willpower alone cannot. Online communities can serve a similar function, though the effects are weaker than in-person groups.
When you participate in an online forum or social media community centered around a particular behavior, you're exposed to constant examples of people performing that behavior. The exposure creates normalization even without direct interaction. You see people posting about their morning runs, their meditation practices, their writing sessions. The behavior becomes part of your perceived social reality, which makes it feel more achievable and more normal to pursue yourself. The inverse is also true. If your social environment normalizes behaviors you're trying to avoid, maintaining different behavior requires constant effort. You're swimming against the current of social norms. Every interaction reminds you that your behavior is atypical, which creates pressure to conform. This doesn't make change impossible, but it makes it significantly harder. Some people successfully maintain behaviors that deviate from their social environment's norms, but they typically need strong internal motivation and often some degree of social insulation from the contrary norms. This is why environmental change is sometimes necessary for significant behavior change. If your entire social circle centers around drinking, trying to quit drinking while maintaining those relationships creates constant friction. The social cues are everywhere. Every gathering is a trigger. Some people manage this, but many find they need to modify their social environment, spending more time with people who don't drink or joining new groups where different behaviors are normalized. The concept of pluralistic ignorance is relevant here. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when everyone in a group privately rejects a norm but believes everyone else accepts it, so they publicly conform to avoid standing out. The result is that everyone maintains a behavior nobody actually endorses. This can happen with unhealthy work habits, like routinely working late or skipping lunch. Everyone might prefer reasonable hours, but because everyone observes everyone else working late, they assume it's expected and continue doing it themselves. Breaking pluralistic ignorance requires someone to publicly deviate from the norm, which reveals that others also disagree with it. Once one person takes an early lunch or leaves at a reasonable hour without apology, others feel more comfortable doing the same. The perceived norm shifts and behavior follows. This suggests that sometimes the most effective way to change a group's behavior is to model the desired behavior openly, which gives others permission to follow. There's also evidence that describing a behavior as becoming more common can increase adoption even if the behavior isn't yet widespread. If people believe a behavior is trending upward, they're more likely to adopt it themselves because they want to be part of the emerging norm rather than left behind. This is used in public health campaigns that emphasize increasing rates of positive behaviors like vaccination or designated driving. The message isn't just that the behavior is good, it's that it's becoming normal, that it's what people increasingly do. The emotional content of observed behavior also matters. Behaviors performed with visible enthusiasm or satisfaction are more likely to be imitated than behaviors performed reluctantly or neutrally. If you observe someone exercising and they clearly enjoy it, that enjoyment becomes part of what you encode. You're not just learning that exercise is something people do, you're learning that it's something people find rewarding. That emotional association makes the behavior more appealing. Social accountability functions through similar mechanisms. When you commit to a behavior publicly or partner with someone else working on the same goal, you're creating social consequences for your actions. The behavior isn't just about you anymore. Others are watching, expecting, maybe even depending on your follow-through. This external expectation can provide motivation when internal motivation is low. You might skip a workout for yourself, but you won't skip it if someone's waiting for you. The social obligation shifts the decision calculus. Some people are more susceptible to social influence than others, likely due to differences in neural sensitivity to social information. Neuroimaging studies show that people vary in how strongly their brains respond to social feedback and social cues.
Those with higher sensitivity show stronger activation in regions like the medial prefrontal cortex when processing social information. This variation means social strategies work better for some people than others. If you're someone who's naturally less influenced by social norms, you might need to rely more heavily on other behavior change strategies. If you're highly socially attuned, leveraging social influence might be your most powerful tool. Habits don't disappear when you stop performing them. The neural pathways remain intact, dormant, but retrievable. This is why people who quit smoking can experience cravings years later when they encounter a familiar trigger. The habit hasn't been erased, it's been suppressed. Understanding this distinction is essential for maintaining behavior change over the long term, because it shifts expectations. You're not trying to achieve permanent deletion. You're trying to build resilience against reactivation. The neuroscience of habit extinction reveals why old habits can resurface so easily. When you repeatedly perform a behavior in response to a cue, you create a strong association in the basal ganglia. That association is encoded through structural changes in the brain, alterations in synaptic strength and connectivity. When you stop performing the behavior, those structural changes don't reverse immediately. The pathways weaken through lack of use, but they don't vanish. The technical term is that the habit undergoes extinction rather than erasure. Extinction is an active learning process, not passive forgetting. When you encounter a cue and don't perform the associated behavior, your brain learns a new association. The cue no longer predicts the behavior, but this new learning doesn't overwrite the old association. It exists alongside it. You now have two competing memories, the original habit and the extinction learning. Which one dominates depends on context, cognitive state, and recent experience. This is why stress, fatigue, and environmental cues can trigger relapse. When cognitive resources are depleted, the prefrontal cortex has less capacity to maintain the extinction learning. The older, more deeply encoded habit reasserts itself because it requires less cognitive effort to activate. The brain defaults to the automatic program that's been there longer. You haven't lost your progress. You've temporarily lost the cognitive capacity to override the old pattern. Research on spontaneous recovery demonstrates this. After a habit has been extinguished through repeated non-performance, simply waiting can cause the behavior to reappear. If you've successfully avoided a behavior for weeks and then encounter the original cue again after a break, the behavior may resurface even without any obvious trigger. The passage of time has allowed the old memory to regain strength relative to the extinction memory. This phenomenon is well documented in animal studies and occurs in humans as well. The implication is that maintaining behavior change requires ongoing vigilance, especially during vulnerable periods. You can't assume that because you've gone weeks or months without performing an unwanted behavior, the habit is gone. The pathway is still there. High-stress situations, major life changes, or returns to old environments can all reactivate dormant habits. Recognizing this in advance reduces the psychological damage when lapses occur. You haven't failed completely. You've experienced a temporary reactivation of an old pattern. One protective factor is the spacing of your new behavior repetitions. Habits that are practiced consistently over long periods are more resistant to extinction than habits practiced intensively over short periods. If you exercise every day for a year, that habit is more durable than if you exercise twice a day for 6 months and then stop. The brain tracks statistical regularity over time. Consistent long-term practice creates stronger encoding than intense short-term practice. This has implications for how you approach habit formation. The goal shouldn't be to establish a behavior as quickly as possible. The goal should be to establish it in a way that's sustainable over time.
A moderate behavior performed consistently for years will become more automatic and more resistant to disruption than an extreme behavior performed intensely for months. The tortoise beats the hare in habit formation, not through speed, but through steady accumulation of repetitions. The concept of habit strength is useful here. Habit strength isn't binary. It exists on a continuum. A weak habit might be easily disrupted by minor changes in context or cognitive state. A strong habit persists even when conditions aren't ideal. Strength builds through repetition, consistency, and time. Each performance of the behavior in response to its cue adds a small increment to habit strength. Thousands of repetitions create habits that are highly resistant to disruption. But even strong habits can be weakened if they're not maintained. If life circumstances prevent you from performing a behavior for an extended period, the habit strength declines. The decline is gradual, not instantaneous, which is why you can miss a few days and resume easily. But extended gaps create measurable weakening. This is why people who exercise regularly for years can find it difficult to restart after a long injury or illness. The habit hasn't disappeared, but it's weakened enough that resumption requires effort. The good news is that reestablishing a weakened habit is typically easier than building it from scratch. The original learning is still present. You're not starting at zero. You're reactivating and strengthening existing pathways. This is sometimes called savings in learning research. The second time you learn something, it happens faster than the first time because remnants of the original learning facilitate the process. The same applies to habits. Rebuilding a lapsed habit usually takes less time than the initial formation. This suggests a specific strategy for managing lapses. When you miss a day or a week of a habitual behavior, priority should be to resume as quickly as possible. The longer the gap, the more the habit weakens, and the harder resumption becomes. A one-day lapse is trivial. A one-week lapse requires some effort to overcome. A one-month lapse can feel like starting over. By prioritizing rapid resumption after lapses, you minimize the weakening and maintain most of your habit strength. The psychological interpretation of lapses also matters. If you interpret a lapse as evidence that you've failed or that you're incapable of maintaining the behavior, that interpretation can become self-fulfilling. You might give up entirely because you believe the habit is lost. But if you interpret the lapse as a temporary deviation from a pattern you're still committed to, you're more likely to resume. The narrative you construct around the lapse influences your subsequent behavior. Research on self-compassion and behavior change shows that people who respond to lapses with self-criticism are more likely to experience extended relapses. The criticism creates negative emotion, which often triggers comfort-seeking behaviors, which might include the very behavior you're trying to avoid. People who respond to lapses with self-compassion, acknowledging the lapse without harsh judgment, are more likely to resume the desired behavior quickly. The compassion doesn't excuse the lapse. It simply avoids adding psychological damage that makes recovery harder. There's also evidence that occasional lapses might not be entirely negative. Some research suggests that experiencing a lapse and successfully recovering from it can actually strengthen your confidence in your ability to maintain the behavior long-term. You've proven to yourself that a setback isn't permanent. This might build resilience. The caveat is that this only works if you do successfully recover. If lapses consistently lead to extended periods of non-performance, they're destructive rather than instructive. The brain's capacity to maintain multiple competing habits simultaneously explains why context is so important in relapse prevention. If you've quit smoking, but you return to an environment where you used to smoke frequently, that context reactivates the old habit. The environmental cues are strong enough to override the extinction learning.
This is why addiction treatment programs often emphasize the importance of changing your social environment and avoiding high-risk situations, at least in the early stages of recovery when the new pattern is still fragile. Over very long timescales, years or decades, old habits do appear to fade more completely. The neural pathways remain technically present, but without any activation, they become so weak that they're unlikely to spontaneously reactivate. Someone who quit smoking 30 years ago and has had no cravings or lapses in that time has likely achieved something close to genuine extinction. But even then, exposure to extremely strong cues could theoretically reactivate remnants of the old pattern. The pathways never completely vanish. This permanence of habit traces is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because it means you can never be complacent about old habits. They're always there, waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. But it's an opportunity because it means that good habits you've established are similarly durable. Even if circumstances force you to stop performing a beneficial behavior for a while, the habit isn't lost. It's waiting to be reactivated. When conditions allow, you can rebuild it quickly because the foundation remains. The practical takeaway is to think of behavior change as an ongoing process rather than a destination you reach. You don't finish changing a habit. You maintain the change. That maintenance becomes easier over time as the new pattern strengthens and the old pattern weakens. But it never reaches a point where you can completely ignore it. The good news is that maintenance gets progressively less effortful. A habit that initially required constant attention eventually requires only occasional awareness. You're not fighting the same battle forever. The battle changes and it gets easier, but it doesn't end entirely. The concept of dynamic equilibrium might be useful. Your behavior exists in a state of dynamic equilibrium between competing patterns. Some patterns are stronger, some are weaker, but they're all present and all exerting some influence. Your job is to continuously tip the equilibrium in favor of the patterns you want to dominate. This tipping becomes habitual itself over time. You develop meta-habits, habits of noticing and course-correcting that help maintain the specific behaviors you care about. These meta-habits might be the most important habits of all because they govern all the others.